The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air of Sam's Diner, a cozy, slightly outdated restaurant nestled in the heart of a small Midwestern town. Sunlight poured through the streaked windows, casting a golden hue over the checkered linoleum floor and vinyl-upholstered booths. The low hum of conversation mixed with the occasional clatter of dishes, creating an atmosphere of modest charm. At a corner booth, Judge Anthony Reeves sat quietly, a newspaper folded neatly beside his untouched coffee. Clad in a simple navy sweater and dark jeans, he could have been mistaken for any other patron enjoying a quiet morning. But beneath his unassuming exterior was a man of immense influence and power. Judge Reeves was the youngest appointee to the state's Supreme Court, a legal mind known for his sharp intellect and unwavering fairness. He had grown up in a rough Chicago neighborhood, rising through the ranks of academia and law with sheer determination. Yet in this moment, he was simply Anthony, content to indulge in the small-town anonymity that came with his modest demeanor. He glanced out the window, watching the world pass by with quiet contemplation. His weekends here were a treasured reprieve from the heavy burden of justice. For years, he had fought not just for his own success, but for others, wielding his position to dismantle systemic inequalities. Despite his achievements, Anthony remained grounded. He still preferred public spaces like Sam's over high-end brunch spots, finding comfort in the unpretentious ambience and the people who frequented them. His phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. He glanced at the screen, a text from his assistant reminding him of a Monday briefing on a high-profile discrimination case that had captured national attention. He sighed, already anticipating the storm that awaited him in court. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed a few patrons stealing glances in his direction, whispering among themselves. He was used to it, the quiet scrutiny that often followed him as a black man in spaces like this. He gave them a polite nod, then returned to his paper. Across the diner, the morning shift waitress, a young woman named Beth, approached his table with a smile. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, holding up the pot. "Yes, please," Anthony replied, his deep voice warm and kind. As Beth refilled his mug, the bell above the diner's door jingled, signaling a new arrival. Anthony glanced up to see a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a police uniform, step inside. Officer Rick Caldwell was a fixture in the town, a man whose handshake was firm and whose words often carried the weight of unchallenged authority. His presence seemed to shift the energy in the room, drawing eyes and nods of respect from several patrons. Caldwell scanned the diner before his gaze landed on Anthony. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something unspoken passing over his face. He made his way to the counter, exchanging a few words with the cashier, his eyes darting back to Anthony every so often. Anthony caught the look and felt the familiar twinge of unease that accompanied moments like these. Returning to his paper, Anthony reminded himself to keep his composure. He had long since mastered the art of navigating such encounters, but the weight of their frequency never truly diminished. Beth returned to Anthony's table, setting down a plate of pancakes with a cheerful, "Enjoy." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "You're not from around here, are you?" Anthony looked up with a small smile. "Not originally, no. Just visiting for the weekend." Beth nodded, her curiosity evident but polite. "Well, if you need anything, just holler." As she walked away, Caldwell moved from the counter toward the booths, stopping just short of Anthony's table. He stood there, his presence looming, until Anthony looked up. "Morning," Caldwell said, his tone neutral but edged with something unspoken. "Good morning, officer," Anthony replied evenly, setting his paper aside. Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly as he gestured to the table. "Mind if I sit?" Anthony gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Not at all." The officer slid into the booth, his movements deliberate. "You passing through?" he asked. "Something like that," Anthony replied, his voice calm. Caldwell leaned back, folding his arms. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" Anthony chuckled softly. "I don't believe so, but I get that a lot." Caldwell's gaze lingered on Anthony, scrutinizing him. "You know, we don't see too many folks from the city out here, especially not in places like this." Anthony tilted his head slightly, his expression measured. I imagine that's true. It's a beautiful town, though. Quiet. Caldwell nodded, though his demeanor remained guarded. It is. We like to keep it that way. The subtle tension in the conversation wasn't lost on Anthony. He recognized this dance, the coded language, and the unspoken challenge. He'd encountered it in countless forms, from boardrooms to courtrooms. Before either man could say more, the bell above the door jingled again, and a young boy burst into the diner, his laughter filling the room. Behind him, a woman entered, her arms laden with groceries. The boy ran straight to Anthony's table, grinning widely. "Uncle Tony!" he exclaimed, throwing his arms around Anthony. Anthony's smile lit up his face as he hugged the boy tightly. "Hey there, champ. What are you doing here?" The woman approached, smiling apologetically. "Sorry, Tony. He saw you through the window and couldn't wait." "No need to apologize, Camille," Anthony said, standing to greet her. He introduced her to Caldwell with a polite gesture. "This is my sister and nephew." Caldwell nodded but said nothing, his expression unreadable. As Camille and her son joined Anthony at the booth, the officer rose, tipping his hat. "Well, enjoy your meal," he said, his tone carrying a note of finality. "I'll see you around." Anthony watched him leave, the tension in his shoulders easing as the officer stepped outside. He turned his attention back to Camille, who raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" she asked. Anthony nodded, though the weight of the encounter lingered. Just another day. Anthony Reeves watched as Officer Caldwell disappeared out the door of Sam's diner, his retreat marked by a faint jingle of the bell. The momentary levity of his nephew's surprise visit began to fade, replaced by the lingering weight of the officer's pointed remarks. Camille, ever perceptive, caught the shift in his demeanor. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again, her voice low enough that her son, now distracted by a coloring sheet Beth had brought over, wouldn't hear. Anthony offered a reassuring smile. "I'm fine. Come. Just the usual." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't press further. She'd heard that refrain too many times to count. Instead, she focused on settling her son with crayons and a glass of orange juice. Anthony, for his part, returned to his coffee, trying to shake the sense of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. The day passed uneventfully enough, though Anthony couldn't help but notice the watchful eyes of some of the townspeople as he ran errands with Camille. In a boutique where she wanted to browse, the store manager lingered a little too long near the racks Anthony stood by, her feigned attempts to rearrange hangers barely masking her suspicion. At the grocery store, the cashier seemed overly eager to double-check the bills Anthony handed over, holding them up to the light as if searching for counterfeit marks. Anthony said nothing during these moments, choosing instead to offer polite smiles and a calm demeanor. He learned long ago that any outward sign of frustration would only feed into the biases at play. Yet, as the small slights accumulated, they began to form a familiar pattern, a quiet, insidious reminder of how his presence was often perceived. It wasn't until late afternoon, as Anthony headed back to his car after dropping Camille and her son off, that the day's tension came to a head. The parking lot encounter. The lot behind the diner was nearly empty now, the lunch rush long over. Anthony unlocked his car with a press of his key fob and was about to climb in when a voice called out behind him. "Hey, you!" He turned to see a wiry man in his 40s jogging toward him, his face flushed with irritation. Dressed in a shirt bearing the name of a local towing company, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to people not questioning him. "Yes," Anthony replied evenly. "You can't park here," the man said, gesturing broadly to the lot. "This is private property." Anthony frowned slightly, glancing around. The diner sign was prominently displayed on the fence surrounding the lot, and no other vehicles were marked with any sort of parking permits. "I was under the impression this lot belonged to the diner," Anthony said. "I had breakfast here earlier." The man crossed his arms. "Yeah, well, it's not for people like you to just leave your car here all day." The implication in his words was as clear as the tension in the air. Anthony kept his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened slightly. "I've been here only a short while," he replied, "and I assure you, I'm not leaving my car here all day." The man snorted, his gaze narrowing. Look, buddy, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'll have you towed if you don't move it. We don't need outsiders coming in and causing trouble. Anthony took a slow breath, willing himself to remain composed. He stepped closer, his movements measured and calm. Outsiders? He asked, his voice carrying an edge of quiet authority. I assure you, I have every right to park here, just like anyone else. But if there's a problem, I'd be happy to speak with the diner owner directly. The man hesitated, thrown off balance by Anthony's confidence. For a moment, it seemed as though he might back down. But before he could respond, the familiar voice of Officer Caldwell rang out across the lot. What's going on here? Both men turned to see Caldwell approaching, his hand resting lightly on the holster at his hip. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze settled on Anthony with a flicker of recognition. This guy's parked here without permission, the tow man said quickly, gesturing toward Anthony as though presenting evidence. Says he ate at the diner, but I'm not buying it. Anthony met Caldwell's gaze, his expression calm but firm. I had breakfast at Sam's this morning. I parked here legally. Caldwell studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. Do you have a receipt? Anthony raised an eyebrow. I didn't think I'd need to prove I had pancakes. The faintest twitch of a smile flickered across Caldwell's lips, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a stony expression. Look, I'm just trying to sort this out. If you don't have proof, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move along. A small crowd had begun to gather now, drawn by the raised voices and the presence of law enforcement. Anthony could feel their eyes on him, a mix of curiosity and judgment. He sighed softly, pulling his phone from his pocket. Let me check my email. I paid with my card. There should be a record. Caldwell watched him closely, his hand never straying far from his holster. The tension in the air was palpable, the unspoken power dynamic hanging heavily between them. Anthony's fingers moved deftly over his phone screen, his calm demeanor belying the frustration simmering just beneath the surface. There, he said, holding up the email confirmation. Receipt from Sam's Diner, time-stamped this morning. Caldwell leaned in slightly to inspect the screen, then gave a curt nod. All right, looks like you're clear. The tow man huffed, clearly dissatisfied, but he muttered something under his breath and turned to leave. Caldwell lingered, his gaze still fixed on Anthony. Be careful, he said finally, his tone low. This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders stirring things up. Anthony held his gaze, his expression unreadable. I have no intention of stirring anything up, officer. But I won't be intimidated, either. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Then Caldwell stepped back, tipping his hat slightly before turning and walking away. The weight of restraint. As the small crowd dispersed, Anthony climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His chest felt heavy, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to release the tension that had built up during the encounter. This wasn't new, not to him. But no matter how many times he faced it, the sting never dulled. The frustration, the helplessness, the anger, it all bubbled beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. But he couldn't let it. Not here. Not now. He started the car, pulling out of the lot and onto the quiet streets of the town. The familiar weight of composure settled over him once more, a protective armor honed over years of navigating a world that too often judged him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. As he drove, his thoughts turned to the courthouse where he'd soon be presiding over a case that had already drawn national attention. It was a reminder of the delicate balance he walked every day between justice and prejudice, power and perception. The conflict had only just begun. Anthony Reeves pulled into the courthouse parking lot, his mind still replaying the events of the day before. It wasn't the first time he'd faced hostility in small-town America, but the interaction with Officer Caldwell had left a bitter taste. The casual threat masked as advice, the looming presence of the tow worker. It all served as a reminder that, for all his accomplishments, he was still subject to suspicion simply for existing in spaces deemed unfamiliar. The courthouse, an imposing stone building with ivy creeping up its facade, loomed ahead. As Anthony stepped out of his car, a subtle shift in the atmosphere gave him pause. The usual quiet of the morning was punctuated by murmurs, and as he approached the steps, he noticed a group of onlookers gathered near the entrance. Their faces carried a mixture of curiosity and unease. At the center of the commotion stood Officer Caldwell, flanked by a younger officer Anthony didn't recognize. Caldwell's hand rested on the shoulder of a wiry man in handcuffs, his face smeared with dirt and streaked with sweat. The man was shouting obscenities, his words slurring together in a way that suggested intoxication. Anthony adjusted his tie and made to walk past the scene, but Caldwell's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hold it right there." The crowd's murmurs grew louder as all eyes turned toward Anthony. He stopped, his expression calm but questioning. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked evenly. Caldwell's lips curled into a tight smile, the kind that held no warmth. "Funny seeing you here. Thought you'd be long gone by now." "I have business here," Anthony replied, his tone measured. "If there's something you'd like to discuss, I'd be happy to do so after I've concluded my work." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Caldwell and Anthony. It was clear he didn't share his partner's confidence in escalating the encounter. Anthony met his gaze briefly, offering a flicker of reassurance before turning back to Caldwell. "This your jurisdiction now, Judge?" Caldwell said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Walking around like you own the place." Anthony took a step forward, his posture firm but non-threatening. "I don't own anything here, officer, but I'd appreciate it if you'd address me with the respect afforded to any citizen." The crowd's whispers grew louder, the tension thickening in the air. Caldwell's jaw tightened, his hand brushing against the baton at his hip. "You're awful bold for someone who's not from around here," he said. "And you still haven't explained why you're loitering outside a courthouse." Anthony's patience began to wear thin, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm not loitering, officer. I'm here to preside over a case." The word seemed to hit Caldwell like a slap, his expression shifting from smug to incredulous. "Preside," he echoed, a sharp laugh escaping his lips. "You're telling me you're a judge?" "That's correct," Anthony said, his tone unflinching. For a moment, Caldwell seemed at a loss, his bravado faltering. The younger officer looked at Anthony with wide eyes, realization dawning. You're Judge Reeves," the younger man stammered. "The one from the state Supreme Court." The recognition rippled through the crowd, the murmurs growing louder as people pieced together who Anthony was. Caldwell's face darkened, his grip tightening on his baton. "Well, Judge Reeves," he said, spitting the title like an insult. "Around here, we don't take kindly to people throwing their weight around." Anthony tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "I'm not throwing my weight around, Officer Caldwell. I'm here to do my job, just as you are." The tension between them was electric, the air crackling with unspoken challenges. Caldwell opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, a voice rang out from the courthouse steps. "What in the world is going on here?" Both men turned to see a woman in a tailored suit descending the steps, her expression a mixture of irritation and concern. District Attorney Angela Mitchell was known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense demeanor, and as she approached, her gaze flicked between Anthony and Caldwell with growing disapproval. "Officer Caldwell," she said, her voice crisp, "care to explain why you're obstructing Judge Reeves?" Caldwell bristled but said nothing, his jaw clenching tightly. Anthony took the opportunity to step forward, addressing Mitchell directly. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," he said, his tone professional. "I was just about to head inside when Officer Caldwell decided to detain me for reasons that remain unclear." Mitchell's eyes narrowed as she turned back to Caldwell. "Is that so?" Caldwell shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, but his defiance remained. "I was just doing my job, ma'am, making sure everything's in order." "Well, everything is in order," Mitchell said sharply. "Judge Reeves is here at my request to preside over today's hearing. If you'd done even a cursory check, you'd know that." The younger officer stepped forward, his voice tentative. "Ma'am, I tried to tell him." "Enough," Mitchell said, cutting him off. She turned back to Anthony, her expression softening. "Judge Reeves, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Please, let's head inside." Anthony nodded, his expression betraying none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. As he followed Mitchell into the courthouse, he could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, their whispers chasing him up the steps. Inside the courthouse, the air was cooler, but no less charged. The case Anthony was presiding over, a wrongful termination suit filed by a black employee against a local manufacturing firm, had already sparked heated debate in the community. The employee alleged he had been fired for raising concerns about discriminatory practices, while the company claimed his dismissal was based on poor performance. As Anthony took his seat at the bench, the room settled into a tense silence. The plaintiff, a soft-spoken man named Terrence Walker, sat at one table with his attorney, while the defense team sat opposite, their lead counsel exuding confidence. Anthony began the proceedings, his voice steady and authoritative. But as the hearing unfolded, it became clear that the defense's strategy hinged not on the merits of the case, but on undermining Terrence's character. Their questions were laced with insinuations, painting him as a troublemaker and an opportunist. "Mr. Walker," the defense attorney said, his tone dripping with condescension, "would you say your actions created a hostile work environment for your colleagues?" Terrence shifted uncomfortably, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to address some issues I saw." "Answer the question, Mr. Walker," the attorney interrupted. "Yes or no?" Anthony's voice cut through the exchange like a knife. "Counselor, your line of questioning is bordering on harassment. I suggest you focus on the facts." The defense attorney's lips thinned, but he nodded. "Of course, Your Honor." The proceedings continued, but Anthony couldn't ignore the undercurrent of hostility in the room. From the whispers in the gallery to the subtle smirks of the defense team, it was clear that the courtroom itself was a microcosm of the larger societal biases at play. As the hearing adjourned for lunch, Anthony made his way to his chambers, his thoughts heavy. He had seen this pattern too many times, the systemic dismissal of legitimate grievances, the subtle but pervasive undermining of credibility. It was exhausting, but he couldn't afford to let it wear him down. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Mitchell stepped inside, her expression troubled. "We got a problem," she said without preamble. Anthony raised an eyebrow. "What kind of problem?" She hesitated, then handed him a file. "Caldwell's been stirring the pot. Word's gotten out that you're presiding over this case, and some folks aren't happy about it." Anthony flipped through the file, his jaw tightening as he read the statements. Thinly veiled threats, calls for him to recuse himself, accusations of bias, all designed to undermine his authority. "This isn't just about me," he said, setting the file down. "This is about the case. They're trying to discredit the entire process." Mitchell nodded. "I've already put in a request for increased security, but I thought you should know. Things could get messy." Anthony leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The stakes had never felt higher, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The courthouse buzzed with a tense energy as the afternoon session approached. News of Judge Anthony Reeves's involvement in the case had spread quickly, fueled by Caldwell's thinly veiled insinuations and whispers in the small-town community. Protesters had gathered outside, their signs alternating between demands for justice and accusations of bias. Inside, the corridors teemed with reporters, attorneys, and onlookers eager to witness the proceedings. Anthony entered the courtroom through the judge's entrance, his black robe a stark contrast to the brightly lit room. His expression was calm, but the weight of the morning's revelations lingered in his mind. He scanned the room, taking in the packed gallery. In the front row sat Caldwell, flanked by a few familiar faces from the diner. Their presence was intentional, a show of defiance. Anthony's eyes lingered on them briefly before shifting to the plaintiff's table, where Terrence Walker sat, his shoulders hunched. Angela Mitchell approached the bench, her face drawn with concern. "It's getting worse," she said in a low voice, careful not to let her words carry. Caldwell's stirring up the crowd. "Some of them are calling for your recusal." Anthony nodded, his tone even. "I expected as much." Mitchell hesitated, then added, "There's more." During the break, someone vandalized Terrence Walker's car in the parking lot. Racial slurs spray-painted across the doors. The news hit Anthony like a blow, but he betrayed no emotion. "Have the police been notified?" "Yes," she said, glancing briefly at Caldwell. "But I wouldn't expect much from them." Anthony's jaw tightened. "I see." Mitchell placed a hand on the bench, her voice urgent. "You don't have to do this, Anthony. If you recuse yourself now, no one could blame you. You've done more than enough." He met her gaze, his tone firm. "Recusal isn't an option, Angela. If I step down, they win. The system wins. I won't let that happen." Mitchell nodded reluctantly, her respect for him evident despite her concern. "Just be careful," she said. "This town has a way of turning on people like us." As the proceedings resumed, the courtroom settled into a tense silence. Anthony called the session to order, his gavel striking the wooden block with a sharp crack. The defense was first to speak, and their lead attorney wasted no time in delivering a series of carefully worded accusations designed to cast doubt on Terrence Walker's character. "Your Honor," the attorney said, addressing Anthony directly, "it is clear that Mr. Walker's actions were not those of a dedicated employee, but of a man seeking to manipulate the system for personal gain." Anthony's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried a quiet authority as he responded. "Counselor, I remind you to base your arguments on evidence, not speculation." The attorney hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance, but quickly regained his composure. "Of course, Your Honor." As the questioning continued, it became increasingly clear that the defense's strategy relied on discrediting Terrence rather than addressing the allegations of discrimination. Each pointed question, each subtle insinuation, added another layer to the tension in the room. Anthony could feel the frustration radiating from the plaintiff's table, but he also knew that he couldn't intervene too often without appearing biased. Finally, it was the plaintiff's turn. Terrence's attorney, a sharp but soft-spoken man named Marcus Allen, stood and began his line of questioning. His approach was methodical, carefully dismantling the defense's claims with well-documented evidence. But as he proceeded, a ripple of movement in the gallery caught Anthony's attention. Officer Caldwell had stood and was making his way toward the exit. He paused briefly to exchange a few words with another man, his expression unreadable. Something about the exchange unsettled Anthony, but he forced himself to refocus on the case. The session was nearing its end when the disruption came. The doors to the courtroom swung open with a loud creak, drawing every eye in the room. Two uniformed officers entered, their faces grim. One of them, Officer Daniels, approached the bench, holding a piece of paper in his hand. "Your Honor," Daniels said, his voice stiff, "we have a warrant for your arrest." The room erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. Anthony remained seated, his expression calm despite the storm raging around him. "What are the charges?" he asked, his voice steady. Daniels glanced at the paper, his discomfort evident. "Obstruction of justice and misconduct." Anthony raised an eyebrow. "Misconduct?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "There's an allegation that you've been tampering with evidence related to this case." The words hung in the air, absurd and hollow. Anthony's eyes flicked briefly to Caldwell, who now stood at the back of the room, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Angela Mitchell sprang to her feet, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. These charges have no basis." Daniels hesitated, clearly aware of the precariousness of the situation. "I'm just following orders, ma'am." Anthony rose slowly, his movements measured. The room fell silent as he stepped down from the bench, his towering presence commanding the attention of everyone present. "I will comply," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "But make no mistake, this is nothing more than an attempt to undermine justice." Daniels gestured for Anthony to place his hands behind his back. As the cuffs clicked into place, the gallery erupted once more, the chaos spilling into the corridors. Reporters followed closely as Anthony was escorted out, their cameras flashing like lightning. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled. Protesters shouted slogans, their voices mixing with the chants of those calling for Anthony's removal. The line between ally and adversary had blurred, the scene a chaotic reflection of the country's larger divisions. As Anthony was placed in the back of a police cruiser, he caught sight of Terrence Walker standing at the edge of the crowd, his face a mixture of fear and determination. Their eyes met briefly, And in that moment, Anthony knew that his fight was no longer just about this case. It was about the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. Angela Mitchell appeared at the car window, her expression fierce. "I'll take care of this," she said. "You focus on staying strong." Anthony nodded, his resolve unwavering. "They think they've won, Angela, but they haven't seen anything yet." The cruiser pulled away, the chants and cries fading into the distance. Anthony leaned back against the seat, his mind racing. The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. But one thing was clear: he would not back down. The holding cell was cold, the dim fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the concrete walls. Anthony Reeves sat on the hard bench, his back straight, hands resting calmly on his knees. The cuffs had been removed upon his arrival, but their weight lingered, a tangible reminder of the humiliation he'd endured. He could hear the faint echoes of voices from the hallway, muffled conversations between officers, and the occasional burst of laughter. Despite the chill in the room, Anthony's mind burned with focused determination. They thought this would break him. They thought the spectacle of his arrest, paraded through the courthouse and plastered across the news, would be enough to silence him. But they had underestimated him. They always underestimated him. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching drew his attention. The door clanged open, and Officer Caldwell stepped inside, followed by Officer Daniels. Caldwell's smirk was wider than it had been in the courtroom, his eyes glinting with smug satisfaction. "Well, well, Judge Reeves," Caldwell said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like the mighty have fallen." Anthony didn't flinch. He remained seated, his calm gaze meeting Caldwell's. "If this is your idea of justice, Officer Caldwell, it's no wonder this town is in the state it's in." Caldwell's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Big talk for someone sitting in a cell. You think your title makes you untouchable? Out here, you're just another outsider trying to tell us how to run our lives." Daniels shifted uncomfortably behind him, his gaze flicking between Caldwell and Anthony. "Rick, maybe we should—" "Quiet," Caldwell snapped, not bothering to look back. "This is between me and the judge." Anthony rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He stood tall, towering over Caldwell by a few inches, his presence commanding despite the circumstances. "This isn't about me being an outsider," Anthony said, his voice steady. "This is about power. You're not angry because of who I am. You're angry because I represent something you can't control. Accountability. Justice." Caldwell's jaw tightened, his composure beginning to crack. "Don't preach to me about justice. You don't know the first thing about what this town needs." "Don't I?" Anthony took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "This town needs leaders who serve its people, not their own prejudices. It needs officers who protect the vulnerable, not exploit their power to silence them." Daniels cleared his throat, his unease palpable. "Rick, maybe we should let him call his lawyer." Caldwell turned sharply, his face twisting with annoyance. "I said quiet." Anthony seized the moment. "Let me guess," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You've told yourself this is about law and order, that I'm some kind of threat to your way of life. But deep down you know the truth. This isn't about me. It's about the fear you feel when someone like me refuses to bow." Caldwell's hand moved instinctively to his baton, his knuckles white. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand on Caldwell's arm. "Rick, stop," Daniel said, his voice firm. "This has gone too far." Caldwell shrugged him off, his gaze locked on Anthony. "Too far," he hissed. "You think he doesn't deserve this? After walking into our town, acting like he's better than us?" Anthony's eyes narrowed. "The only person I see acting out of arrogance is you, Officer Caldwell. And if you're so sure of your righteousness, then why resort to lies and intimidation to silence me?" The words hit their mark. Caldwell's face darkened, his mask of confidence slipping to reveal the simmering rage beneath. "You think you're untouchable," he spat. "But everyone has their limits." Anthony remained still, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Caldwell's growing fury. "The only limit I've reached," Anthony said, "is my patience for men like you." The door to the holding area swung open again, this time revealing Angela Mitchell. She strode in with the force of a storm, a folder tucked under her arm and fire in her eyes. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Caldwell straightened, his smirk returning as he turned to face her. "Just having a little chat with our esteemed judge." Mitchell's glare could have melted steel. "That's enough, Caldwell. I've been on the phone with the state attorney's office. They're already looking into this circus you've created." Caldwell's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Mitchell stepped forward, her voice cold and sharp. "The warrant you used to arrest Judge Reeves? It's a fraud. Fabricated evidence, forged signatures, sloppy work, even for you." Daniels took a step back, his face pale. "Wait, what?" Mitchell turned to Anthony, her expression softening slightly. "We're getting you out of here, Anthony. This is over." Caldwell's face twisted with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Mitchell shot back. She opened the folder she was carrying, pulling out a stack of documents. "These are the real records, obtained directly from the courthouse archives. They don't match the ones you submitted to justify your warrant. Care to explain that?" Caldwell's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Anthony watched him closely, his expression unreadable. "This is a mistake," Caldwell said finally, his voice unsteady. "Someone must have—" "Save it," Mitchell snapped. "The state attorney has already issued a formal inquiry into your actions, Caldwell. You're done." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Caldwell's face was a storm of emotions. Fear, anger, and desperation all vying for dominance. "You think you've won?" he said finally, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over." Anthony stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're right, Caldwell. It's not over. Because men like you thrive in systems that protect their corruption. And as long as that system exists, I'll keep fighting to dismantle it." Caldwell sneered, but there was no conviction left in his expression. He turned on his heel and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. Mitchell turned to Daniels, who looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "You're complicit in this, Officer Daniels. But you have a choice to make right now. Are you going to help clean up this mess, or go down with him?" Daniels hesitated, his gaze flicking to Anthony. I didn't know about the forged warrant," he stammered. "I just followed orders." "That excuse won't save you," Mitchell said. "But if you cooperate, it might mitigate the consequences." Daniels swallowed hard, then nodded. "What do you need?" "Start by filing a full report on everything Caldwell has done," she said. "And be prepared to testify if it comes to that." Daniels nodded again, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his actions settled over him. Mitchell turned back to Anthony, her expression softening. "I'm sorry it came to this," she said quietly. Anthony shook his head. "It's not your fault. This was inevitable." Mitchell placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're free to go. Let's get you out of here." As Anthony stepped out of the police station and into the cool night air, the weight of the confrontation began to lift. But the fight was far from over. The crowd outside had dispersed, but the echoes of their chants lingered in his mind. He turned to Mitchell, his resolve stronger than ever. "This isn't just about Caldwell. It's about the entire system that enables him." Mitchell nodded. "Then let's take it down." Anthony looked out at the dark horizon, the faint glow of the courthouse visible in the distance. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had his determination. He had faced the storm and emerged unbroken. Now, it was time to turn the tide. Anthony Reeves stood before a packed room at the emergency community hearing, the courthouse abuzz with tension. What began as a simple wrongful termination case had spiraled into a test of systemic integrity. His recent arrest had drawn national attention, casting a glaring spotlight on the town's deeply rooted prejudices and the forces working to protect them. He adjusted his tie as the room settled into an uneasy silence. Seated in the front row was Officer Caldwell, his expression a mask of false confidence. Flanked by his attorney and a few supporters, Caldwell had refused to back down despite mounting evidence of his misconduct. To his left sat Daniels, who appeared more like a man awaiting sentencing than an officer on duty. The air was thick with expectation. Judge Reeves, began the presiding magistrate, a stern but fair woman named Eleanor Grayson. You requested this hearing to address accusations of misconduct within our law enforcement. The floor is yours. Anthony stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. Thank you, Magistrate Grayson, he said, his voice calm but resolute. He turned to face the room, his words measured and deliberate. Over the past several days, this town has witnessed the unraveling of a facade, a veneer of justice masking a deeper truth. I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a man who has experienced firsthand the abuse of power that too often goes unchecked. The audience was silent, their eyes fixed on him. Anthony continued, his gaze sweeping the room. Officer Caldwell's actions were not isolated. They are the product of a culture that enables misconduct, that shields its own from accountability. But today, we will bring the truth into the light. He turned to the magistrate. With your permission, I'd like to present evidence that directly implicates Officer Caldwell in a pattern of systemic corruption. Grayson nodded. Proceed. Angela Mitchell rose from her seat, carrying a stack of documents. She approached the bench, handing over records, emails, and surveillance footage. These materials, she said, her voice firm, include falsified warrants, altered reports, and communications between Caldwell and others in positions of power who sought to undermine investigations. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the weight of the evidence palpable. Caldwell's attorney stood abruptly, his face red. Objection. These documents have not been authenticated. They were obtained legally and verified by the state attorney's office. Mitchell interjected, her tone sharp. The only thing in question here is your client's integrity. Grayson held up a hand, silencing the exchange. The evidence will be reviewed in full. For now, continue. As Mitchell returned to her seat, Anthony turned his attention directly to Caldwell. Officer Caldwell, he said, his voice steady but cutting. You've used your position to intimidate, manipulate, and silence those who dare to stand against you. But it ends today. Caldwell leaned forward, his composure slipping. You don't know what you're talking about, he spat. I've done nothing but serve this community. Anthony's expression didn't waver. You've served yourself under the guise of service. You've weaponized the trust placed in you to protect your own interests. Caldwell shot out of his chair, his face twisted with rage. You think you're better than us? Walking in here, acting like you own the place. Enough! Grayson's voice rang out, her gavel striking the block. Officer Caldwell, you will remain seated, or I will have you removed. Caldwell hesitated, then sank back into his chair, his fists clenched. The room was silent again, the tension thick enough to cut. Anthony took a deep breath, his resolve unwavering. This isn't just about me, he said, addressing the room. This is about every person who has been wronged by a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It's about Terrence Walker, who stood up against discrimination and was silenced for it. It's about countless others whose voices have been ignored. He turned to Daniels, who sat with his head bowed. Officer Daniels, you have a choice to make. Will you continue to protect a system that has lost its way, or will you stand for what's right? Daniels looked up, his face pale. For a moment, he said nothing, the room holding its breath. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached for the microphone in front of him. I want to tell the truth, he said, his voice shaking. Caldwell, he told me to go along with the warrant, even though I knew it was wrong. He said it didn't matter because no one would question him. The audience gasped, the revelation sending shockwaves through the room. Caldwell's face went pale, his bravado crumbling. Daniels, Caldwell hissed, his voice low and threatening. Don't do this. But Daniels pressed on, his voice gaining strength. I can't cover for you anymore, Rick. I'm done. Anthony stepped closer to Daniels, his voice calm but firm. Thank you for your courage, Officer Daniels. It's not easy to stand against someone you've trusted, but it's necessary. Turning back to the room, Anthony addressed the magistrate. Magistrate Grayson, I submit that Officer Caldwell's actions have not only harmed individuals, but have eroded the trust of this entire community. I urge you to act decisively to restore that trust. Grayson nodded slowly, her expression grave. The evidence and testimony presented here today will be thoroughly reviewed. Rest assured, justice will be served. As the hearing adjourned, the tension lingered in the air. Anthony stepped out into the hallway, Angela Mitchell by his side. Reporters swarmed, their questions flying like arrows, but Anthony ignored them, his focus elsewhere. Caldwell appeared in the crowd, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He shoved past the reporters, his eyes locking on Anthony. "This isn't over," Caldwell snarled, his voice low enough that only Anthony could hear. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you've started." Anthony met his gaze, unflinching. "The only thing I've started is the end of your corruption, and I'll see it through." Caldwell stormed off, his presence like a dark cloud dissipating into the crowd. Anthony watched him go, the weight of the confrontation settling over him. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, the tide was beginning to turn. That night, Anthony sat alone in his hotel room, staring out at the quiet town below. The day's events played over in his mind. The confrontation, the revelations, the fragile hope that justice might prevail. His phone buzzed on the table, a message from Angela Mitchell. "The state attorney's office wants a full report tomorrow. We're making progress, but it's going to be a long road." Anthony picked up the phone, typing a brief response. "I'll be ready." As he set the phone down, he took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome was far from certain. But he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop fighting. The courthouse steps were quiet the next morning. The crowds dispersed after the previous day's chaos. Inside, the tension lingered, but there was a noticeable shift in the air. A sense that something had finally cracked in the town's foundation of unspoken rules and systemic inequalities. Anthony Reeves stood in the magistrate's chambers alongside Angela Mitchell. The two of them reviewed a final set of documents detailing the findings from the emergency hearing. The evidence and testimony gathered had been decisive. Officer Caldwell's pattern of abuse, falsified documents, and intimidation tactics had been laid bare for all to see. Magistrate Grayson looked up from the papers, her sharp gaze meeting Anthony's. "The state attorney's office is filing formal charges against Caldwell," she said. "His badge and authority are officially revoked. He'll face trial." Anthony nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "It's a step in the right direction." "It's more than a step," Mitchell interjected. "It's a message. The system isn't untouchable anymore." Grayson leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Judge Reeves, your role in this has been unprecedented. I won't pretend this was an easy fight, but you've forced this community to confront truths it has ignored for far too long." Anthony's lips curved into a faint smile, though the weight of the moment was still heavy. Truth has a way of demanding attention, no matter how much we try to bury it. Grayson nodded. "And now the question is what we do with that truth." By midday, the courthouse buzzed with news of Caldwell's arrest. The disgraced officer had been escorted from his home by state investigators, his once proud uniform replaced with plain clothes. Reporters swarmed the scene, capturing every moment as he was led to a waiting car. Caldwell's face was a mixture of anger and humiliation, his bluster finally silenced. Inside the courthouse, Daniels approached Anthony in the hallway. The younger officer looked nervous but determined, his shoulders squared as he extended a hand. "I just wanted to say thank you," Daniels said, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture, "for giving me a chance to do the right thing." Anthony shook his hand firmly. "It took courage to stand up and speak the truth, Officer Daniels. That's the kind of integrity this community needs." Daniels nodded, a faint flicker of hope in his eyes. "I want to help fix what Caldwell broke, whatever it takes." "Then start by holding yourself and others accountable," Anthony replied. "The system doesn't change overnight, but it changes one decision at a time." The consequences of the hearing reverberated beyond the courthouse walls. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a microcosm of the broader fight against systemic corruption. Anthony's name became synonymous with resilience and accountability, his actions inspiring conversations about reform in communities far beyond the small town. At the diner, Beth, the young waitress who had served Anthony on his first morning in town, watched the news with wide eyes. "That's him," she said to the cook behind the counter. "The judge I told you about." The cook nodded, his expression thoughtful. Maybe he's what this town needed. Across the community, the cracks in the old ways began to show. Discussions about accountability, bias, and the role of law enforcement filled town halls and dinner tables. For the first time in years, there was a sense that change was not only possible, but inevitable. That evening, Anthony sat on a bench in the park where his journey in the town had begun. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light over the trees. He had come here to think, to process everything that had happened. The bench felt heavier than it had before, the weight of his experiences pressing against him. Camille arrived shortly after, her young son in tow. The boy ran ahead, laughing as he chased fireflies in the growing dusk. Camille sat beside Anthony, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "You did it," she said softly. Anthony shook his head slightly. "I didn't do it alone. Mitchell, Daniels, Grayson, they all played a part. But you started it," Camille pressed. "You stood up when it would have been easier to walk away." He sighed, his gaze following her son as he darted through the grass. "It shouldn't have to be a fight every time, Cam. People shouldn't have to risk everything just to be heard." "No, they shouldn't," she agreed. "But that doesn't mean the fight isn't worth it." Anthony nodded, her words settling over him like a bomb. He had faced the storm and emerged intact, but the battle had left its mark. He knew he wouldn't stop fighting, couldn't stop, as long as there were systems and people in power willing to exploit the vulnerable. The following week, Anthony returned to his courtroom in the city. The familiar rhythm of his work was both comforting and sobering, a reminder of the countless cases still waiting for justice. His desk was piled with briefs and motions, but among them was a handwritten letter from Terrence Walker. "Judge Reeves, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. You didn't just help me. You helped everyone who's ever been silenced. I hope you know how much it means. I'll never forget it. With gratitude, Terrence Walker." Anthony set the letter down, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a reminder of why he'd chosen this path in the first place. Later that day, he met with Angela Mitchell in her office. She was already working on drafting new policies for law enforcement oversight, her desk cluttered with legal codes and notepads. "Back to the grind?" he asked, his tone light. Mitchell grinned. "You know it. Reform doesn't happen on its own." Anthony leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "If you need any help," she raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering to join the fight?" He nodded. "I think I've got a little more left in me." That night, Anthony stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city skyline. The lights of the buildings twinkled like stars, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the work still to be done. He knew the challenges ahead would be steep. Caldwell's trial would be grueling, and the cultural changes the town needed would take years to fully realize. But for the first time in a long time, Anthony felt hope, not just for himself, but for the people who had been inspired by his stand. As the city hummed below, he took a deep breath, the weight on his shoulders replaced by a quiet determination. The fight for justice was far from over, but Anthony Reeves was ready to continue leading it. Anthony Reeves sat alone in his chambers, the dim light of his desk lamp casting a warm glow over the papers before him. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, the echoes of the day's proceedings still faintly lingering in the air. It had been weeks since the hearing in the small town, but its impact followed him like a shadow. The fight for accountability, the revelations of corruption, and the quiet resilience of those who had stood by him. Each moment was a thread in the fabric of change he had helped weave. For Anthony, the ordeal had been a crucible, testing the limits of his patience, his composure, and his faith in the very system he had dedicated his life to upholding. He leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, not just to the bench but to this moment of clarity. The Anthony Reeves who had walked into that diner months ago, content to blend into the background, was not the same man who now sat contemplating the future. He had always believed in justice, but the events in the small town had crystallized his understanding of what it truly required. Justice wasn't just about interpreting laws or handing down rulings. It was about standing firm in the face of systemic inertia and risking personal comfort for collective progress. Through the trial, the arrest, and the public scrutiny, Anthony had grown more resolute. He had seen how power could corrupt and how silence could enable injustice. But he had also witnessed courage, the hesitant but necessary stand taken by Officer Daniels, the tireless efforts of Angela Mitchell, and the quiet determination of Terrence Walker. They had reminded him that change, no matter how incremental, was worth fighting for. As he organized his thoughts, Anthony felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come out of this battle scarred but stronger, with a deeper commitment to dismantling the structures that perpetuated inequality. The case had become a flashpoint in the town and beyond, sparking conversations that reverberated across the state. The exposure of Officer Caldwell's corruption had led to broader investigations, uncovering a network of complicity that reached higher than anyone had anticipated. Several officers had resigned under pressure, and new protocols were being implemented to ensure transparency and accountability. In the community, the impact was just as profound. People who had once felt powerless found their voices, organizing town hall meetings and demanding reform. The courtroom had become more than a place of judgment. It was now a symbol of possibility, a space where truth could come to light and wrongs could be addressed. Terrence Walker, whose wrongful termination suit had sparked it all, became a local hero, his courage inspiring others to come forward with their own stories. The manufacturing firm settled his case out of court, issuing a public apology and pledging to review its hiring and firing practices. For Terrence, it was vindication, but for the town, it was a wake-up call. Anthony understood that the fight was far from over. The progress made was fragile, and the systems that upheld inequality were deeply entrenched. But he also knew that change wasn't linear. It came in waves, driven by those willing to stand up and say, "No more." As he reflected on the broader implications of his struggle, Anthony thought about the countless others who faced similar battles in silence. People whose stories never made headlines, whose injustices were met with indifference. He thought about the young boy who had run to greet him outside the diner, too young to understand the weight of prejudice, but destined to inherit its consequences if the system remained unchanged. Anthony knew he couldn't fight every battle, but he could lead by example. He could use his position to amplify voices, challenge biases, and demand accountability. Most importantly, he could show others that resilience, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could make all the difference. The events of the small-town courthouse were a microcosm of larger societal issues: racism, abuse of power, and the insidious ways prejudice manifested itself in everyday life. They revealed how systemic problems weren't just about individual bad actors, but about the structures that allowed them to thrive. For Anthony, the lesson was clear. Change required more than good intentions. It required action, persistence, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. It required a collective effort, with each person playing their part, whether by speaking out, supporting reforms, or simply listening to those whose experiences were different from their own. The next morning, Anthony sat on the courthouse steps, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The city was waking up around him, the hum of life a reminder of the endless possibilities each day brought. Angela Mitchell joined him, a stack of papers in hand. "You're starting early," she said, sitting beside him. Anthony smiled. "Justice doesn't wait." She handed him one of the papers. "These are the preliminary plans for the Oversight Committee. We're moving forward, Anthony. Slowly, but we're moving." He nodded, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. "Good. This isn't just about what we've done. It's about what comes next." As they sat in companionable silence, Anthony felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he was ready to walk it. He thought about the people who had stood by him, the community that had found its voice, and the systems that were beginning to shift under the weight of accountability. For the first time in a long time, Anthony felt that justice wasn't just an abstract ideal. It was a living, breathing force, one that required constant care and vigilance, but one that could, in time, transform the world. Justice isn't just a destination, it's a journey. It's the quiet resolve of a man who refuses to be silenced, the courage of a community to demand better, and the willingness to confront the flaws in the systems we trust. Anthony Reeves had learned this lesson the hard way. But he emerged from his trial stronger and more determined than ever. The fight wasn't over, but as the sun rose on a new day, it brought with it the promise of progress. And for Anthony, that was enough to keep going.